The 85th annual Sturgis Motorcycle Rally hasn't started just yet, but many vendors and visitors are starting to line the streets in the city of riders. Several seasonal shops along Main Street in Sturgis have opened their doors ahead of the rally, expecting high attendance and profitable business this week. Multiple vendors setting up shop along the north side of LaSalle Street say they tend to see fairly good sales numbers the week before rally. Biker groups from around the country have also begun arriving in Sturgis. Members of one group from Idaho mentioned they decided to make the trip early to give first-time rally attendees a chance to ride around the hills before traffic increases substantially.